Welcome to your history for Thursday, April the 2nd, and we are on number 25. We haven't sung our president song in a couple days, so let's review today. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk and Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan, Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, and Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush and Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Donald Trump. Okay, there you go. All right, 25. This is a house I have been to. His house is in Ohio, and there is a museum attached to it right next door on the First Ladies. And so there's several dresses that belong to the First Ladies, and and different kind of odd items. There's also some campaign buttons. They have a bunch of campaign buttons in there. It's just a tiny little museum. But so this is the house here. Okay, that's the picture on the front. And then I took kind of a close-up picture of the plaque on the front because that told you whose house it belonged to. And the light wasn't extremely good in this picture, but I hope you can see this is one of the pictures in his study. And I think this was used in one of his campaign posters or something, and it's his wife and his mother. And it was the only one whose mother was represented in one of these posters. I thought that was really interesting. And then here is a picture of McKinley down here. I've always thought that he seemed a little, in his pictures anyway, he comes across looking kind of gruff or maybe a little grumpy, his big eyebrows. But everything that I've read said McKinley was probably one of the most liked presidents. He was so friendly. Everyone loved him. He was hard to disagree with. He was so pleasant. And he was so extremely good to his wife that he made everybody else look bad. This is someone that, he was just, if you were just talking about someone's personality, you would just say he's a good guy. He's just a good guy. So his main facts, let's get down. He was a Republican. 1897 to 1901. This is a little bit deceiving because it looks like one full term. But in actuality, what it is one full term and the start of a second, and then he's assassinated. Okay? And you see a clue to that by seeing that his vice president is Theodore Roosevelt, and we know that he comes next. McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, right? So, and we see the clue because there's two vice presidents. So either something happened to the first one or there's been two terms, and there were two terms. And it was very, very beginning of his second term that he was shot. So one of his nicknames is Wobbly Willie. Even though he was very liked, I think one quality of him was that some people thought that he was just kind of wishy-washy and would kind of go with different people's opinion. So, okay, you got the facts down? Now, First Lady. Now, this is an interesting one. Okay. Her name was Ida Saxton, and she was born in Canton, Ohio, to a wealthy family. Her dad was a banker, so they had a lot of money. She grew up well. She was well educated. She went to school. She even went on a tour of Europe. A lot of well-bred women who had a good education and whose family had a lot of money, would finish school and then they would go on this European tour. And it was like they were having part of their education, that you needed to know about the world and have experienced part of the world. And that's not, I don't disagree with that. That's not a bad idea to I think the more we go places and the more we see things, that does make us more educated because we see more things and we're able to understand more and have more things up here that we can relate to. Um, so soon after that, she started working in her father's bank, which is really interesting because it's not, she was the first lady to have a job other than teaching. Teaching was considered a suitable job for a woman, one that women would have, but anything else was almost not accepted, not something that you should even that should even be desirable. You shouldn't want to work, especially a wealthy girl. What reason would she have to work? But she worked as a teller at her father's bank, which was pretty interesting. Now, when McKinley met her, she was lively, she was fun, she was energetic. That kind of woman we don't continue to see. She changes. And she has two children. Um, one dies very soon after she's born, and the other one dies, I think, before she's 2. So after the first one dies, her health does start to go downhill, start to get worse, and then especially after the 2 die, her health continues to get worse and worse. And right around this time, her mother dies also. And so all of the mental shock, all of the just the shock to her system or whatever was happening at the same time. And she became an epileptic. And an epileptic is someone who has seizures. Now, seizures can look different ways. Sometimes people who have seizures just kind of, and it's a thing that happens in your brain. Sometimes, some people have been known to have seizures once and then never have them again. Other people, it's a constant kind of struggle that they have. And now there are medications that people can take to help with those. But it's something that triggers the brain. And one thing that happens is that they can just kind of stare and everything just kind of stops. And that's one kind of seizure. Another type of seizure is where you actually shake and convulse, and those can be very dangerous too because you can hurt yourself because your body doesn't have any control over its muscles and what it's doing at the time. So she started having seizures. Hers were more of the kind, I think she did have some movements, but I think they were more of the kind of staring kind. McKinley was the word that we would use is doting. He was very caring. Anything she wanted, anything she needed, he was always there. And I love this bottom picture of them because it shows her very much kind of propped up in her fancy dress and sitting there very still. And then it shows him looking at her. Ooh, excuse me. Looking at her in like a caring way. And that's exactly how he was. He seated her next to him at White House dinners, which was not what usually happened. The First Lady was usually across the table, but he wanted her right next to him. And if he saw that she was having one of these seizures coming on, he would just continue his conversation, whatever was going on. He would just simply quietly lift up his napkin, put it over her face, and just continue to talk. And then whenever she was done with her seizure and she was back, she would just take down the napkin and just continue the conversation wherever they left off. And it was to save her embarrassment of her convulsions and different things of her face that might happen while that was happening. He would just simply cover it, and then when she was done, she would take it off and they would just continue conversation and go right back to what they were doing. One thing I read, I would want to check the source of this, but I do remember this, that when he had his law office in Ohio, he was actually very close to the house. And at certain times, he would actually take a handkerchief and like wave out the window at her. And she was directly across so that he could see her. It was before telephone. So it was like, I'm doing okay. How are you doing? Checking on you. At a certain time, he would always check in with her. If she wasn't feeling well, he would eat dinner with her in her room. He was just very caring of her. Um, and one, I think I have it on a different slide, but there's a quote of someone that says that he made all of the men in Washington look bad because he was such a good husband, so caring, so devoted, that he made every other husband look not as caring. One thing that she did, that was one thing that she really enjoyed to do, and she did almost all the time, was that she made thousands of knitted slippers. And she gave these knitted slippers to friends and to charities. And she just sat and she just knitted these slippers all the time. And here is a picture of a pair right here of the slippers that she knitted. But because her health was so weak, a lot of the duties of the First Lady fell to the Vice President's wife, and she took on some of those responsibilities. She also was almost always seated in White House receptions when people would come along and shake their hands, and everyone always hated all of the shaking hands. It's so funny how much I've read about how different people try to get out of different ways of shaking hands because it just hurt them all the time. So she was always seated, and she was usually the only one seated because it wasn't usually what you did. But she was seated, and she almost always had a bouquet of flowers in her hand. And that was basically just a sign that she was not going to shake hands. Um, and she just sat and she was there and she greeted people, but she wasn't expected to stand or to shake hands. She just wasn't very well. Okay. All right. His personal, McKinley's personal. He was born on January 29th in 1843 in Niles, Ohio. He was a fun-loving boy that loved being outdoors. So everyone that remembered him as fun and cheerful and loved to do things outside, fishing and hiking and anything outside. He was raised in a Christian home. His mother was Methodist and raised him to be so. And he kept his belief in God during his whole life. I read that um, he encouraged people to sing hymns with him on Sunday evening while he was in the White House. Um, After he was shot, he was heard to be reciting the Lord's Prayer as he was being taken into surgery. Um, there are several different things that shows that he was a Christian man and continued his belief all the way through his life. And it's not always a sign, but I think one thing that we can see is his kindness. It just because you're kind doesn't mean you're a Christian, but I do think that you can see some fruits of the Spirit in our lives when God is working in us. And I think we could see that with how he took care of his wife and how he responded to other people. And I'm going to tell you a little story that kind of shows that too after he was shot. Okay. So he was educated well, he had some education, but during the Panic of 1857, when there was a depression and a lot of people were losing money, he had to leave his schooling to go to work to help his family. So when he would have continued, he actually stopped. And then he went into Civil War, served in the Civil. He was young. He was like 16 or 17 when he served in the. Actually, wait a minute. No, if he was born in 43, Civil War started in 61. So yeah, he was about 18. And he served in the Civil War. And he actually fought at a battle. I've been to this park in Carnifax Ferry, West Virginia, and there was a battle fought there. And he actually fought in that battle. So I thought that was kind of cool that he fought in a battle in West Virginia. After the Civil War, he went back home. A lot of former soldiers were going out west and trying their fortune with the different mines and the different things that were being found. And he went back to Ohio and set up a law office. He passed the bar, which is the law examination. You didn't necessarily have to have any formal school then, even to be a lawyer. You just had to pass the test. And he did. Um, and he set up his law office in Canton, Ohio, and became popular there. He became a U.S. representative between 1877 and 1891. Then he served as the governor of Ohio between 1892 and 1896. And then that leads right directly into his presidency when he was elected to be president. As a president, he was considered the first modern president. And I think this is because he seemed to be more active in the world around him and its affairs. Instead of just taking care of the United States and its people, he was more interested in the things going on in different nations. Okay, so this is personal, but also the ending of his presidency. He gave a speech at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, which is in New York, in 1901. There was a man named Leo, I think you say this, Kosgaz, and he was what we call an anarchist. An anarchist is against all government. So he believes that the people should run everything and that anyone that has more shouldn't have more than he does. And so he was standing in line. The president was shaking hands at the end of this exposition, and he was standing in line with his hand bandaged up like this, like he had a sore. Okay, and he extended his hand to shake hands with the president, and then he shot the president twice with a gun he had hidden in his bandage. And then, so he was shot twice, kind of in his belly area. Then after he was shot, the crowd was like running and attacking this guy and trying to catch him, and they were like beating on him. And the first thing that the president says is he begged them not to hurt him. Tell them not to hurt him. Don't hurt him. That was his first thought. That's what I said about how it kind of does show a Christian spirit is one that is self-denying. So his first thought was for the man that shot him, not for himself. And then his second thought, he turned to the guy with him, his assistant, and said, "Please be careful how you tell my wife. My wife, please be careful." Because he knew his wife's health was so delicate that if they were not careful in the way that they told her that he was shot, that she would die also. He was afraid. And so his thought was immediately to the man that shot him, don't hurt him, and then to his wife. Very cool. Okay, so just a couple more things that I did mention, but I wanted to say again, this one I mentioned. He was a very friendly person and almost everyone liked him. Some said he made it very difficult for other husbands in Washington because he was so caring. Okay, he was just so caring about his wife. And then one kind of fun fact is that he was known to wear a red carnation in his buttonhole as good luck. He was almost never seen without a little red flower in his buttonhole. I think there's different things. I don't know if that was just for campaigning or if it was all the time. I think it was all the time that he had one in his coat. Again, my point in doing this is that these presidents are people. They were real people with personalities, with beliefs, with their beliefs going in. And if we could see how they thought, what their lives were like, it might give us a little bit of an idea of why they did some of the things they did while they were in office. And it gives us a little bit more respect of them as how much they had to take on as people. And as we learn this about people in history, please don't forget this about the people you're seeing on TV right now. When you see the president on TV, when you see your governor on TV, when you see other governors in the other states on TV, they're real people. with real lives. They may have people in their lives sick. They may have problems in their families, and yet they're having to take on this enormous amount of responsibility. So this is your time. Pray for them. Remember the lady that wrote Arthur letters and many think had an influence in his presidency? Pray for your leaders. Write them. We can have an influence. It doesn't matter how small our voice is. We can have an influence. Okay, so let's do this. In your comments below, I want you to, out of all the presidents, just the ones we've studied so far, so Washington to McKinley, I want you to name one person below that you wish that you could meet. Okay, one. From Washington to McKinley, which president would you most like to meet and why? Both parts. Don't just give me a name. Which president would you most like to meet and why? Got it? Have a great day.